I have some things I want to pick your brain about. Tonight, specifically, what's on my mind is family work. And I'm curious about a lot of things, how the Life Process program approaches working with families, the extent to which you work directly with families, which I would imagine is quite high.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe some more specific questions about like sort of what, as an LPP practitioner, what do you do when a family member says X, right? And I have a couple different X's and Y's for those questions.
I'll do my best.
Yeah. But my general question to start off would be, I know you have a bunch of different hats. You work in the school system and you do your LPP stuff. I guess the question can be answered from either of those angles, but to what extent do you work directly with family members when you're working with, let's say, a young person who's struggling with an addictive involvement?
It depends. I do consulting work or just family counseling kind of work independently. Gotcha. And so it just depends how much how much need there is for that.
Gotcha.
And then during the day, I do work in school districts, but it's less consulting with families and more working with teams at schools.
Gotcha. So working more directly with the young person involved and not necessarily the family.
Right. It's usually how I'm usually helping that young person live their life at school. And often,
gotcha.
I shouldn't say never, does that manifest into working with families also, because people want to know what's up at home and what their input is. But yeah, in large part, when I'm working in the school district I work for, which, by the way, I should say that I don't speak for. I have to do that, one of those disclosures that all opinions are my own kind of a thing.
Right.
But yeah, it's usually how they can navigate through the school day.
So in the context of, let's say, your independent consulting work,
okay,
are you more often than not approached by parents who are concerned about a young person's maybe addictive involvement?
Yes.
Okay. And in a case like that, like I'll speak from my own experience. When I worked in conventional addiction treatment, which I did for like 10 or 11 years, there was often this notion of, this kid has a problem. We, as his or her parents, have done the responsible thing and brought them to a re-education center, right, where it will be patiently explained to them that there is something wrong with them, and they will be given a prescription as to what to do. And of course, you can hear the sort of sarcasm in my voice suggesting that there are serious limitations to that way of conceptualizing it. And often what I would try to do, whether it was as a sort of low guy on the totem pole counselor, or when I eventually was in a more administrative role where I did to some extent get to set the tone of the treatment, I was trying to sort of bring the family in a more thoughtful, compassionate, balanced way, where it was like, maybe this young person's addictive involvement is an expression of something that you might want to be curious about rather than dismissive of or avoidant of. And yet, to get to the nub of the matter, that perspective was a tough sell to a lot of parents, because it, comes quite close to saying the climate of the family may have had something to do with this, and that's an uncomfortable reckoning. It also comes quite close to saying you guys might have to put in at least as much, if not more, effort than this young person in sort of untangling this. So I guess part of my question is that consistent with your experience, and how do you try to navigate that sales pitch to a family or a set of parents?
Usually untangling why those people have contacted me is It has to be delicate, I suppose, but usually I can get to a place where, okay, two situations. Either I'm talking to the young person and trying to figure out, what do you really think is the problem?
Mm.
And I'll even say, totally above board, you can talk about drugs being a problem. You can talk about alcohol being whatever the thing is. But we don't have to talk about that. Obviously, you're here, and whether you're here of your own volition or if you're here because your parents are placing you here and you don't want to be, it seems like there's some issue either way. It could be that the issue is you need to live in some sort of harmony with your parents or your guardians, and you're obviously not feeling like you're in a good place to negotiate because you're here. Or maybe that person really thinks that, yeah, I'm behaving in some destructive way and I'm not sure why, and I'd like to get to the bottom of it, or maybe a little bit of both.
Mm.
And talking through that stuff with that young person, and then insofar as I have their permission to discuss any of those things, or at least the keynotes of our discussion with the parents, usually it doesn't take much for me to say to the parents something like, well, I feel like I'm trying to be broad, and it would be easier to be specific, and I'm not sure how to do this, but let's just say it's a drug problem. But a lot of times the people sending their kid to work with me, I say sending, but people who have asked me to work with their kid and their family have more than just the child is taking drugs as their sets of problems. So if I come back and say, your child was saying that this and this and this are issues, and he'd like to work through it, what do you think about us spending our time working on those things to start? I don't think I've ever gotten pushback, as long as those things are honest. Sometimes people will have a different perspective than their kids, and then if they do, that suggests to me that there's some sort of problem with collaboration and communication. And so I might say, what would you say if we worked out some way to communicate a little bit more effectively, whether that means helping your child understand how best to address you, or you better understanding how to address them, and put forth a collaborative effort to figure out what the problems are that need to be solved. And you can both have a part in that. So that's how I usually address that. And the other side of things is that's if the child is talking to me first, and then I have to report back or something. But a lot of times I just can cut to the chase with the people who want me to work with their child, and I almost always am just completely above board and saying, and let's say again it's a drug problem, that as he was taking drugs before he came to talk to me, he was taking drugs despite what you want him or her to do differently. So let's call that an issue if you think it's an issue. And also let's see what's at the bottom of that, what's underlying all of that. And almost always, if you could figure out what's underlying it, then at least that person could build attractive alternatives and be in a better position to speak logically about what's going on. So that's usually how I begin things.
So you're asking, it sounds like, because this is consistent with part of the way I try to approach it too, you're asking for a certain degree of like, let's put this sort of hot potato of the addictive relationship at least temporarily on a shelf, and try to explore things sort of through other angles, which of course is quite contrary to the way many families see it at first, or have been, I'm holding back from saying brainwashed, but have been conditioned by a lot of conventional approaches to see it, which is this sort of, you're not going to get anywhere until you sever that relationship between your child and the addictive entanglement, right?
Right.
So do you find, I certainly find sometimes familial momentum against that perspective, and it can take a sort of alarmist tone, right? In other words, I don't understand. What are you saying? You're not worried about my kid? You don't think he's going to die if he continues to do X, Y, and Z? And, depending on how the personality is involved and how sort of compromised the family system is, all of that stuff can be quite intense, right? Is that consistent with what you encountered? This sort of, what is this guy nuts? He's asking me to calm down about the drug thing and focus on other things. Is he out of his mind?
I'm pretty good at threading that needle now, but if we're going to cut to the chase, it's the conversation isn't so much, hey, let's put the drug thing on the back burner and get to something else first. It's more, wow, it sounds like there are some issues. And I think that people actually crave the honesty in saying, because as you know, I'm sure, or you can tell me, but I think people have a vague idea of what therapy or this kind of work is supposed to be. And oftentimes people are coming to this for the first time. And a lot of times people are doing this with their first child or only child that they've ever. So they have an idea of what help looks like. As you say, they're conditioned to understand some broad framework about what help is. And it's, you're going to feed the person the story about what they should or shouldn't do. And that'll fix them. And I think people sort of crave the honesty in looking behind the curtain, which I'm giving them the opportunity to do, and saying, I know that it would be nice if there was a quick fix, but we kind of all know that I can't do that, and anybody who tells you that they can do that is lying to you. So what I want to do is figure out, what is this child, this young person, up for discussing? I mean, what, how can we get this person thinking on a track that's somewhat consistent with what you want to be thinking about, but so that they're generating the ideas themselves, i.e. motivational interviewing. And so I'm basically explaining motivational interviewing to these parents while simultaneously doing that with them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty consistent with the way I try to work with families too. I think in a lot of ways, I end up working with, and you may as well, a lot of people who've been sort of through the mill of conventional addiction treatment. And in some ways that works in favor of the type of approach we're trying to take.
Right.
And in some ways can work against it, because there is so much sort of fear-based conditioning that goes on there. Not that fear isn't valid and justified in some of these situations, but some people are burnt out on the conventional treatment system to the degree that kind of honesty is like, well, wait a second, at least this is not another used car salesman type of situation.
Right. The message I want to give people is that whatever this problem needs in order to be addressed, acknowledged, and turned into some sort of success, I'm in it for the long haul. And I want to just be completely honest and fair and thoughtful about how these things change, because life doesn't just change overnight, and everyone knows that. And I think especially, maybe probably getting to this is what you're saying, but people who have been through the ringer kind of do want to know that they have somebody who's invested and is thoughtful, at least.
Right. And as you say, sort of looking at the long game, like this sort of, it's not about wagging your finger and getting somebody to stop doing something. It's about a relationship and fostering creativity and curiosity and all that stuff that your book, which I read, by the way, the Child in Me was about, was really great, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
So I wonder if you can put on your slightly different hat of LPP. With LPP, my sense is, and part of why we're having these conversations is for me to learn a bit more about LPP's way of doing things, which a lot of it is consistent with my natural approach anyway. But I'm curious, my sense is you work mainly with adults in that context. Is that accurate?
Yep.
In a situation like that, is LPP sort of for, let's bring in whoever wants to be brought in? Are there, collaborative sessions with family members, maybe spouses, etc., or does that tend to be a much more sort of exclusively one-on-one thing?
there's a dialogue that's gradual that people get into with their coaches in the life process program that often invites collaboration with family members. And usually by the time someone suggests it, it makes sense in some capacity, either if that person wants it and really believes that's something that's going to help them. Okay. The pushback one might give or a coach might give wouldn't really be pushback. It'd be more questioning, why do you think this would be helpful? Do you think are the other reasons why it could be unhelpful? Is it worth it doing it now? Is it worth waiting? Those kinds of things. But yeah, there are really no rules attached there. If somebody thinks that bringing somebody else in and having this dialogue with them is going to help, we do it. And oftentimes, we do preach is not the right word. We do talk about social involvements, whereas sometimes people send themselves or check themselves into a rehab or sent to a rehab or whatever. They're sort of becoming more lucid, but in a context way away from home. Whereas if somebody's bringing their normal relationship partners into the fold, then I think that's a boon in most cases.
Gotcha. So my two, what do you do when a family member blank? I have at least two. There might be more that come to me.
It always scares me when someone's asking questions and they pick up a pen.
That's just,
you're gonna drill me. No, I'm kidding.
total fidgeting on my part. So I suppose there's a way to think about this question both, because, well, let me ask you this first of all. Do you think working with young people is meaningfully and fundamentally different in some way than working with adults? And what I find so interesting about you as a person and as a thinker is I genuinely have no idea whether you're going to say yes or no. I really don't.
I don't either.
Great. Perfect.
I mean, it just depends the way I'm thinking about it. The principles remain the same, but it's just often the case that a young person who is working with me is doing so because there is also a guardian or parent or some older person in their lives, a mentor in their lives who thinks that they ought to. So more often than not, when I'm working with an adult, most times those people are in negotiation with themselves about their lives. And when I'm working with children, same, but with the added layer of being in negotiation with other people and who have just legally and developmentally slightly less agency and ability to generate things on their own.
Gotcha. So principles are the same, but all of the context.
Young people are generally under the auspices of somebody older who is looking out for their best interest. Yeah.
Right. So let's say this could apply to a young person. It could also apply to an adult with a spouse, depending. When someone says, for example, you're 16 years old, right? Your client is 16 years old and they're smoking pot, a lot of pot. And the parents say, well, one of our instincts is take away the car. Let's say they have a car that we provide for them, that we pay for. And we're going to take that away because our sense is we can never be sure whether or not he or she is, intoxicated in some way. That's a safety risk, open and shut case as far as we're concerned. That behavior continues, we take the car away. As our consultant, Mr. Rhoads, what do you think of that approach?
I have a lot more questions for this family, but okay, at some level, they're the parents, and I would encourage them to create consequences that match the crime, so to speak.
Gotcha.
that match the behavior they're trying. But you were saying that if they're worried that someone's going to be intoxicated and driving, that's a safety thing. And I think what's key that you said is they never know whether that person's going to be intoxicated and driving. So I would be immediately, my first thought is that I'm going to be trying to create an arrangement where insofar as this person is going to be using a drug, that they're they have some pretty set boundaries that they work on, and conditions in which that person can. If that's not an option, I mean, if it's like you're either not or you are, and if you are ever, then you're not going to be driving this car, then well, that's a whole nother ball of wax, I suppose.
That's the option I see proposed.
But
quite
so
regularly.
the thing is with that, usually those parents aren't going to want to take away that kid's car privileges for that long. There are things about being 16 and then moving forward that could compel that adolescent to continue with that behavior, and also that would motivate a parent to get that kid driving and doing things on their own. So then it's just, we're talking about a balancing act where, I would just then encourage to make sure that consequences that are set indefinitely, that person is thinking about what are the sequential order effects of that consequence in the future. Thinking about future scenarios where that person may need to drive. And so we should probably work out some collaboration and conversation and communication beforehand, so that before we get to that point, there's an exit plan here.
Generally, the emphasis is sort of on like, I'm not, again, motivational interviewing style, I'm not going to sort of come steaming out of the gate with opposition to whatever the family might be coming up with, but I am going to try to sort of slow it down a little bit and help them really consider, well, what does that actually look like a week from now, a month from now?
I often talk to people about the consequences and the limits that they've set in the past, and ask questions about how they've held up. And there's really nothing good about setting limits that you can't keep. In every way. I think you just sort of lose. If it's a power grab that you're after, which most people aren't, most people are just concerned for safety. But let's say it is, you kind of lose your power, you lose your influence in that situation if you keep saying, I'm going to take your PlayStation away, and you never do, whatever. So that's not really.
You give it back the next day, or
yeah. I mean, it's not really a behavior changer. So one way or another, I have ways of doing it depending on the situation. I'm always trying to get at what's underlying a behavior so that can actually be changed, so that someone is in a position to make a change in the right direction, the direction that's going to lend to better communication.
So like discipline and punishment have a place, but thoughtfully, in a considered way.
Sure. I'm laughing because I'm thinking about my 2.5-year-old right now. And actually some of the first work, I work with all ages from 0 to adults. I think my youngest client ever was an infant with their families. And my oldest client is in his 80s.
Wow.
So I really worked across the lifespan. And
I'll say,
not only do the same principles apply, you were asking earlier, from when I'm working with adults to working with adolescents, but I feel the same principles working with the 0 to 3 range really apply to these scenarios too, where giving someone I just keep thinking about, as I say, my daughter, I'm trying to think about, wait, what should I be doing here? What's a reasonable thing to do? Is it to this behavior that I really don't like? I want her to know that I don't want her to do it, but I also want her to know the reason I don't want her to do it. I also want her to have some sort of freedom to offer me this sounds like pretty existential for a 2.5-year-old, but I swear to God, it's happening, to offer me a reason why she would still want to do it. And I want to stay open-minded enough. So I'm thinking, like, do I give her a replacement thing to do, an attractive alternative to do? Do I set a pretty firm consequence, but make sure that it matches, whatever. And I'm always also thinking about positive discipline and empowerment. So I'm always trying to think about how to make my daughter, make a child, make anybody feel empowered by explaining to them how I see them in a positive way, reflecting that it sounds like they feel like what they did was positive,
Mm.
or reflecting that it sounds like the thing that they did made a positive impact on somebody else.
Mm.
So when you talk about like the 16-year-old with the car, all of those I would want to bring into the fold. It's much more complicated than
Sure.
you know, do a drug, you're screwed kind of a thing. Almost always.
Right. I'm curious. I don't know that I've ever heard that phrase positive discipline before. Is that from a particular like sort of framework, or is that just
I don't know who to I may have come up with that on my own. I may have borrowed it over the years, but if I have borrowed it, I don't know who to offer the credit to. So sorry for whoever it is.
no worries? Could you speak to it a little bit, like what your conception of that is?
Yeah. I think about punishment, discipline. A lot of times people think punishment, and I watch all the time teachers who are managing classes of 20 to 30 kids, no matter what age, are consistently using, I see consistently using forms of punishment, and not just, I think of punishment as more than unilateral setting of a consequence. I also think about it as like bribing, cajoling, doing things that win the moment for you, but
Shaming.
but it's shaming, sure, but they don't get you anywhere. And it's certainly not in, if your goal is to help that person flourish and learn and develop. So I think a positive discipline as limit setting that's reasonable, realistic, insofar as you need to make a unilateral decision that it's meaningful and it matches, you know what I mean? That it's and it's consistent. But also thinking about why a behavior that you don't want to happen is happening. What's your part in it, and how can you forge a collaboration and help that person be independently making a choice that would probably be better in their own best interest.
So there's like a high degree of sort of internal deliberation in what you're describing, which I think,
which no one ever perfects. It's just like, it's just a trend that I think is better to go down.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was going to say, I think in my way of working with families, I think that's, and it's interesting. I have to be very careful. I don't have children, right? So I make the disclaimer, I mean, really like a broken record, this sort of like, it's funny you use the word principles before, because that's often the word I sort of fall back on. Like, I'm not a parent telling you how to parent. I'm somebody sort of trying to introduce certain principles into the conversation that can be matched to parenting, just like they can be matched to gardening, hypothetically, right?
Right.
Parenting obviously is a lot more emotionally loaded, but I'm always careful to make that disclaimer so that it's not a sort of, there's a right way to parent that I am conveying to you, but rather it's like deliberation and thoughtfulness are helpful. Right.
Do you remember,
like, that's not very controversial.
No, I don't think that's, I think that's not the least bit controversial.
Yeah.
Do you remember meeting Stanton's? It didn't happen that long ago, so I hope you remember. We met a friend of Stanton Peele's, and he's a musician, and he was telling a story about his father, and his father said, "You don't have to like me. You don't even have to love me. The one thing you need to do is stand on your own 2 feet."
Right.
As you grow up, and that's non-negotiable. That's the essential thing that you need to do.
Sure.
That's, I don't know about the don't have to like me, don't have to love me, but I mean, you can't force anyone to do that. But getting your child or the child in your care to stand on their own 2 feet seems like the most reasonable goal that creates the best outcomes for everyone. If as long as you're not just thinking only in the moment, that's how I like to think about it. And we talked about values last week, and I do like to have a conversation, whether it's totally overt or just tacitly around this, but I like to try to figure out what these people's values are, family values, and what the goal is for their child before we create any steps forward, or else you get tasked with trying to answer the question, well, what should I do? What should I punish him? What boundaries should I set? And it just would be so nice if there were answers like that.
Right.
But you do have to just ask the question, well, what is your goal? Somehow you got to get there.
Right.
I think I'm
Right.
getting lost in the conversation in my own mind now, but
No. It's interesting. I mean, there is that sort of continual, in a way, I've almost come to see that question from family members of what should I do? Or sometimes it's, hyper specific. Should we let him stay over at Kevin's house on
right.
Friday? I mean, it can literally become a sort of like, tell us what to do. And I, over time, have sort of embraced that question as a reminder of like, that's exactly what I'm not going to do. You know what I mean? It's like the more specific the question is, in a way, almost the easier it is for me to be like, I'm not sure if you should let him stay at Kevin's on Friday or not, but let's talk about the principles at work here, right? Like, what are you trying to achieve by preventing that versus granting that?
There's almost this like archetype, and it's like satirical, of a psychologist or psychiatrist or whatever, therapist, where someone says, what's my problem, doc? And like, well, what do you think the problem is?
Right,
but
right.
as annoying as it is, it's not like, well, what do you think the problem is? You don't, that's just too on the nose. If they knew that answer straight away, then why would anyone be asking you? But I do, when it's like, should I let him sleep at Kevin's house on Friday night? My knee jerk is always to go to a question about that.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
mm-hmm.
I'm always thinking about, I'm sure you're familiar with a cognitive behavioral cost benefit grid, where it's like, well, what would be the benefit of staying at Kevin's? What would be the downside? What would be the benefit of not letting him stay at Kevin's? What would be the downside? Even some just simple kind of thinking like that helps people answer their own question, I think.
I have a bunch of things I'm curious about. I'm trying to sort them through in my head about where I want to go. I think the next thing I want to ask about is emotion. That just a simple topic like emotion. I expect you to, break that down for me in a digestible way. Emotion gets in the way of all this, obviously. I mean, any good cognitive behavioral therapist, and in my experience, there are a lot of ones who are not particularly good in terms of how sort of rigidly they try to adhere to the model without accounting for emotion or being subtle about how they account for emotion. And I think emotion gets in the way of, executive functioning and higher order thinking and planning and all that stuff. And I'm wondering, oftentimes the degree of emotion in a family system about addictive entanglements specifically, or at least ostensibly, that's what the emotion is about. Oftentimes you discover it's really not so much about that. That's just a convenient hook to hang it on. But family members can be highly emotional in these situations. Obviously, makes total sense. The more provocative the behavior, if that's the right word, or the more extreme the behavior, the more emotional. And it can manifest in different ways. One parent might be highly anxious and, God, we have to come up with a solution. Another might be furious and silent and every manifestation in between. And so, I have my way of trying to work with that starts with acknowledging it in a really explicit way. But I'm wondering what your conception of how to work with that is, in terms of like, if it's clearly getting in the way of the ability to plan, deliberate, be sort of thoughtful. Where do you go with that, as in your consulting work or in LPP? Does the question make sense?
The question makes sense, and I have two tracks I guess I could go. Do you mind if I talk about both a little bit?
Please.
So you read that little essay, kind of a book that I wrote, and my charge in that book, he came to the conclusion. I mean, he's the one who put it better than I had heard it before studying cognitive behavioral therapy in earnest, really. But he had this idea that anxiety means you think something horrible is going to happen, and that you think something's going to happen, and when it happens, it's going to be horrible. And so if you take that apart, you can ask yourself, what are some reasons this thing is not going to happen? And then let's say this thing does happen. What are some reasons it's either going to work out okay and not be horrible? Or you could even think beyond that and think, let's say this thing happens and it feels horrible. What kind of benefits might I get out of it? Not always as easy to do as to say, but that's sort of the sort of conversation that I try to bring up when people are at a heightened emotion and a cognitive distortion about whatever the thing is that they're worried about. Everything is just such an emergency. So maybe something is an emergency. If it is, then you have to handle it like an emergency. If someone needs to go to the hospital, they need to go to the hospital. You know what I mean? But everything else that it's taking, they're worried about tomorrow, then we have all day to talk and think about this and run through some scenarios. And so usually I meet people there. If I can get some good conversation and collaboration out of people with that kind of idea where we talk through the distortion or talk through the irrational fear or talk through the rational fear in a way that they can actually make some sense out of it, then I usually go to a model that I learned from Dr. Ross Green. You know this guy?
I don't think so.
He's a child psychologist. It's so funny because he's a 5 times New York Times bestselling author, and nobody knows him. And so I almost want to go look in the archives to see if he really is a New York Times bestselling author. But he has a great model, and it's one of those models, sort of like if I do say so myself, like the life process model that's purely common sense. It's like you can't call me or Stanton really or anyone like a guru, because it's really just take the basics. So he has this model where the idea is people who are really worried about things, if it's a behavior of a kid or whatever, and these behaviors keep popping up over and over again, and it just seems like, well, this is out of control. Then you have so much competing for your attention that maybe you don't even know where to start. And so I could take this from the perspective of parents or teachers or kids themselves. And there's this collaboration model that he put forward just to consolidate these ideas and prioritize them, where he has you can either deal with things unilaterally, you can deal with things collaboratively, or you can put things on the back burner if they can stay on the back burner. Not meaning they're not important, but you just put them on the back burner for now. So you have a conversation about, well, what are kinds of things that are emergencies that you must deal with unilaterally, and you can talk about those. But really the important thing is, what are the kinds of things that you really want to focus on? What are the top 3 priorities, 1, 2, and 3? And for those things, each party who I might be working with has a perspective about why they're problems. So let's just say it's a teacher whose student is constantly showing up late. I would help foster a conversation that starts with an adult asking, it seems like you're having difficulty getting to class on time. What's going on? Or maybe that's my role as a liaison in that case, to ask that question. And that's really just a total listening conversation, a one-sided conversation where you're listening to what that person thinks is going on, and maybe some reflecting and digging about what the underlying problems are. And then you come to that conclusion, and either it's in a different conversation down the line, or it's after this person's perspective has been exhausted. And then you can say, it sounds like it's difficult for you to get to class because then whatever those reasons are. The thing is, when you don't get to class on time, it's difficult for me to teach to the entire class. I have to put more focus on you. And there are reasons why that's so difficult for me, and I can't arrange my class that way. I wonder if there's a way that you can get your needs met and that you can get to class at such a time that I can actually teach the entire class. So you're broadening the perspective beyond just, you suck, there's a problem.
Right.
And so you do that, and you come to a consensus about where people can meet in the middle. And it's not a negotiation where people have to sacrifice too much of what they need. It's a collaboration where both people are talking about the needs that they have, and both people are working toward. Go ahead.
Compromise.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's not a compromise. It is a true collaboration. I think that's the big difference. So
Gotcha.
in this person, Dr. Ross Green's model, you come to a point of collaboration, and you have jobs to do. Each person has jobs to do for the top 3 things that seem to be besetting this whole relationship. And for the rest, there might be 1,000 behaviors that annoy you, but you've picked 3. You've picked 3. And once one of those seems to just sort of flow into day-to-day life and it's working out, if there are other problems, then you can take that one out. And if you think there are other problems that are unsustainable or difficult to manage, you can put another, so number 1's out. So now you have 2 and 3, but you can add another collaboration on there. So just a way to sort through and prioritize. And I think that's a brilliant model, a brilliant way to conceptualize what's going on when you're trying to work with another person. Usually you can't collaborate on more than 3 things at a time, maybe, but that's sort of what's going on anyway. That's like the day-to-day and humming of regular life and frustrations. Your question was, what do you do when someone's getting the emotional ties? And my answer, I guess, is to give each person a job, and not too many jobs. A job that satisfies both parties' needs and the difficulties that they're having and what they want, and that it's enough effort on both parts that you have to do something to change it, but not so much effort that it's exhausting and overwhelming.
Now, let me ask you this, and I'll put the disclaimer beforehand, right? That I don't know if this is peeling back the curtain too much. I'm even wondering about that myself as the one asking the question. I think it seems fine to me. It doesn't seem like peeling back the curtain too much to me. I'm moved to ask, because you are so kind of sort of grounded and thoughtful and deliberate in the way you respond to questions and the way you think about things. Do you ever get rattled by the intensity of the emotionality in a situation?
Absolutely. I don't think that thinking more about it, working with more people, and even doing these things in my own life I don't think it solves the problem of me getting rattled in the moment so much. Maybe it does. Maybe it does. But yeah, I get tense, and I really try to notice it. And I don't always. And if I don't, I try to go back and address it. And I try to do what I preach. But so, yeah, I definitely get rattled. I definitely make decisions in a way that I wish I didn't. But one thing I can say is that I almost never make one of those decisions that would ruin my relationship with a client, or especially a child, or put myself in a position of power over somebody else who is more vulnerable.
I would say, yeah, I'm thanks for articulating that, because I would say that's about where I would think of myself in terms of that question. Like, sort of definitely get rattled sometimes, when, particularly obviously when something is really challenging in terms of the intensity of emotion, or maybe to some extent the personalities involved, can definitely get sort of clenched, right? But that there is always this, as you said, opportunity. And sometimes it takes me, unfortunately, sometimes it takes me a while to recognize it, but there's always this opportunity to introduce that in a sort of thoughtful, compassionate way. Like, just sort of say, I got to be honest, like, I'm having a little bit of trouble being thoughtful right now because of the intensity. Can I maybe invite us all to just take a deep breath? And sometimes you can't even get that across, right? But that idea that we do have the opportunity to acknowledge and sort of demonstrate, model, in a sense, the kind of, I'm noticing something, I'm saying it, I'm owning it, right? I'm kind of taking responsibility for it.
Good point.
I'm asking for your sort of acknowledgement of it to some extent, but I'm not asking you to fix it for me. You know, it's very different than saying like, you got to calm down, lady, you know, which is like,
right. Yeah,
which
great.
is obviously
well
a bad
put.
idea.
Well put. I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of think that no one wants to work with somebody who's always calm.
Mm.
I don't know. That might sound counterintuitive, but I think you know what I mean. It's like there's
Yeah,
something
yeah.
superficial about someone who's always level. There's just not. There doesn't exist that person.
Right.
People might have different ways of showing it, but so I'm keen on working with. If I'm a client, I'm keen on working with someone who wears their stress on their sleeves but can articulate it.
Right. Right. Very, very well put.
By the way, simply losing my keys makes me get bent out of shape. I've torn the house apart before in embarrassing ways when I can't find my keys to get to work or something like that. So it actually doesn't take much.
Right. I ruined the nearly perfect segue a moment ago because you said something about being in a position of power, not intentionally choosing not to put yourself in a position of power, particularly when you're working with a young person, but in general. And that segues quite nicely into my second, what do you do when blank question, which is, and I've been dealing with this a lot in my own practice recently. So it's part of the reason it's front of mind and I'm finding it so interesting to navigate. Do you ever, I'm trying to think how I want to frame this. When a family comes to feel that we've exhausted every possibility, which of course is usually not true, but let's say that's the emotional tenor of the situation. We've exhausted every possibility. The only option at this point is rehab, wilderness program, some sort of send the person out to a thing that will correct the problem. You know, my understanding is that LPP is fairly explicitly, I think it's fair to say fairly explicitly anti-rehab, right? Is that fair to say about LPP?
It's fair to the extent that well, I can't be an absolutist about anything. I just, as long as people are not delusional that going to a rehab resets in a way that will just manifest into everyday life immediately, or that there's no other solution, because then you go to a rehab and then maybe things will get better, but really what happens is you're left with all the same problems in your regular life. So we're explicitly that. I mean, we're not shy about putting that out there.
Gotcha. So the principle of thoughtfulness and deliberation and realism, those principles apply to the notion of rehab just as much as they apply to the notion of anything else. So we often get the question, I often get the question, I assume you often get the question, and other LPP coaches, et cetera, often get the question of, how do I know when that sort of big red button that says rehab on it is the thing I need to press, right? And it's interesting because parents certainly could be one of the vehicles whereby that question is coming at you or me, but also, you know, there could be a person, as you said, an adult is more often in negotiation with themselves about life, right? And there could just as much be a chance that someone is sitting there saying, I feel like I'm banging my head against the wall. I feel like I set X, Y, and Z goals with you or on my own and consistently fall short of them. It's painful for me. I'm feeling like I need to do something drastic, so to speak, or significant. And I'm curious about what your disposition is. I mean, again, I can sense that it's always going to come back to those principles of, let me help you think through this in as constructive a way as possible.
Exactly.
So I answered my own question.
Well, I don't know. Go on.
It's funny. I guess part of what I'm asking is, given the sort of common sense ideology that informs LPP and that I think informs both of us as just people and practitioners, I guess I'll speak to my own experience. I sometimes am quite explicit in a situation with a young person that I do not necessarily think rehab or wilderness program or et cetera offers the best option. I think I am also always careful. I believe I am always careful to say, that's just my perspective, right? You could certainly easily find someone in the addiction sphere 5 minutes from now by doing a simple Google search who will tell you, absolutely, you ought to send this kid you should have sent this kid to rehab 6 months ago. So I'm always deliberate about owning it as my perspective, right? But I will sometimes say, I'm not sure I endorse that as the best option. And the reason I think that's significant, and Stanton might even think that is significant about me, because Stanton has pegged me as a chronically ambivalent person, right? He put his finger on that I have a sort of a, well, but if this, then that, and who's to say, you know. And so it's interesting to me that sometimes in a situation with a young person, I will be fairly explicit about, I'm not sure I endorse that, right? And again, I'm always careful to say, but that only means as much as it means. That only means some guy named Sean Kensing that you happen to be talking with right now doesn't necessarily think that's the best idea. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It doesn't mean you won't decide to do it. But I am somewhat explicit when it's a young person situation. I do feel an almost an ethical obligation. I don't know if it's quite so strong as an ethical obligation, but almost an ethical obligation to at least introduce skepticism.
You win.
About
okay. Yeah, you win. I really do think there's an ethical, like I couldn't leave that conversation without getting to a clear, without delivering a clear message that if you're asking my opinion, I want to know, what is rehab? What are you looking to get out of it? And just knowing that I can't think of a case where a rehab will satisfy those things that a person wants. I probably wouldn't say it as explicitly, but I'm also not as ambivalent as I seem. It's just that the problem with playing Question Man, even though it's fun, is that you don't have the context. So usually with context, it's a more fluid sort of conversation, and people can generate their own feelings about that. And but yeah, I mean, the rehab racket is something we're explicitly against. Like the idea that there are places that cost $40,000 a month that say that they're the only hope in a person's life. It's just wrong. And so, by
the way, you're being generous with the monthly rates.
Am I?
I've seen that. I mean, I agree that that's a ludicrous price, but they have only gotten more ludicrous in the last like 2 years. Even.
Tell me I know this is tangential, but tell me an average price.
I don't know if I could meaningfully speak to an average price just because, but I have heard routinely in the last couple of years, figures like 60, 70,000 being thrown around. And that might be catered to a certain segment of the population, a certain socioeconomic situation. But yeah, if if we're going to scoff, we have to even raise the hypothetical figure we're scoffing at, because 40,000 was like sort of par for the course, I would say, like 5 or 6 years ago. Still seemed ludicrous to me at the time, still seems ludicrous to me now. But, I don't know if it's just inflation or if it's also something more craven that's contributing to it, but it only seems to be going up. And obviously there's a world of private out of pocket for pay rehab for the sort of middle to upper classes, and there's a world of insurance based, ostensibly not for profit, although obviously somebody's making money on it somewhere, rehab for the sort of people without resources. And I think what's interesting about it is they're both poisonous in very, very different ways, right? That they're both poisonous for their audience in very, very different ways. But yeah, Stanton, in fact, in an email that I think you and I were both copied on, or maybe it was just me emailing him at some point, but he made a similar comment, and I sort of said in response, and I heard a guy today quote somebody at 75,000 or something. So it's insanity. It's really insanity.
It's kind of like buying a lottery ticket. So that's the thing I'm explicit about is, are you putting your eggs into one basket because you're avoiding the difficulties in your life and you think that something is going to be solved for you, or are you facing your life head on? And right. I think that, I mean, this, but that's just so often the case, is that it's so difficult and painful to face life head on if life is turbulent. So my best work would be helping people figure out how to face life head on in a manageable way. And I really can't think of a case where the manageable way to do that is to spend a lot of money on an inpatient rehab where you're sent away and then you come back and are facing the same problems. But I leave space in my mind reserved for that possibly being the case, depending on the circumstance. There are families I've worked with who have kids who were adults, and they're torn in this place where they want to provide the best resources and care for that person because they're worried for their safety and they want to make sure that they live and they're okay. And on the other hand, they're going nuts in their home, like tearing the hair out of their head, and they need space from this person, and sending that person they can't leave. So they could send that person somewhere else. Even in those cases, I think there are probably more reasonable alternatives than the place to be sending that person being a rehab. So I'm scratching my mind for a time where I wouldn't try to influence the conversation that way, but I still need to be a thoughtful onlooker of that experience for them and let them sort that out on their own. Yeah. Strategically, of course, but
just out of curiosity, when you say I still think there are more attractive options than rehab, do you mean just sort of other contexts that involve sort of solitariness and personal growth and development, or do you mean something else entirely? Or?
Well, if the problem is this person living under my roof, I feel like unsafe with, or
they're driving me nuts.
I mean, I just can't stand them. Yeah. Still, I mean, I guess it could be that if there's some place that's a rehab and maybe it takes insurance and it's whatever, then it gets them away from the house. I mean, there's at some point some people need to set their own boundaries, even if they seem like they're curt. But I am still, I'm still always tempted to figure out what other options there are besides sending someone somewhere where they're going to likely ingest some sort of ideology and be given a story that what they are is bad. So the behavior that they're choosing is bad, but maybe no real ways of ameliorating that. I really worry about that. So it's not just like the rehab. I think I guess I'm saying I'm trying to give a reductio ad absurdum and say, and it's not even absurd, it's real, but I'm trying to think of a case where I could imagine being sympathetic to wanting to send someone somewhere. And God, if a rehab is the only place that makes sense to do, maybe that person needs some space. I'm still going to talk about, what is it that person is going to do there? Are they going to leave a better fit for life, or are they going to leave a worse fit for life, and why or why not? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thing to navigate. I mean, again, people who have had a lot of contact with conventional addiction treatment can often be sort of like shocked and provoked when I'm sort of like, it's an option, but let's talk about it. Let's think about it. When what they expect is sort of, all right, we got the van idling outside. We just got to put them in the back. And, like that's sort of much more black and white, kind of dogmatic. This is what you do,
Right.
Even if you've done it 6 times before, this is what you do again. Right. So yeah, it's funny that thoughtfulness, even just thoughtfulness, can be sort of provocative.
In the spirit of harm reduction, by the way, I like to think about harm reduction with respect to rehabs. So if, let's say that circumstance does come up where it seems to make sense, just like get this person away from me, and also I do want them to be healthy. I have seen places that are, people go there, it's almost like a kibbutz or something. They're working, they have roles, they're gaining life skills, and these places that are called rehabs are more dedicated to those kinds of life enhancement strategies than they are to telling people they have to remain abstinent forever. So I might, if what that person has decided is it needs to be a rehab, I might try to suggest or think about places that at least offer those pro-social, pro-living kinds of educational services.
Yeah, which, as you say, do exist. They might not have like the same stranglehold necessarily as more conventional places, but yeah, they do exist. Cool. There's one more question I want to ask you, just out of my own curiosity. When you say you've done consulting work, and this is shifting gears quite a bit, but when you say you've done consulting work with, infants, so to speak, what does that mean? I'm like totally baffled. I have no idea what you might mean by that, but I'm really curious.
It's usually the family that I'm trying to support in that case. And
so it's not the infant that calls you for a consultation, in other words.
That would be great. I'd be really the child whisperer then.
Yeah.
No, it's usually a family who themselves are struggling, but maybe who are trying to get their lives on track or things sorted out, and they have such a cognitive load that it's very difficult to care for an infant. So the consulting I'm doing then is and by the way, it's very rare. There's only a few infants that I've ever with people with infants that I've worked with.
Right.
But, there, I'm just trying to figure out, given what your circumstances are and what your resources are or could be, how best to care for your child. And so I've done that with infants. It was mostly toddlers then at this organization, and
wow,
2-3-year-olds they can wreak havoc in the household as much as anybody.
Sure. Wow, that's really interesting.
That is a good, fair question.
Yeah. Someday I'd love to pick your brain more about that, but yeah, I think those were my two sort of, and I bring these questions to you in large part just based on sort of what happens with my work throughout the week, and it happened to be a week of a lot of, I think, great family work ultimately, but difficult family work that was shot through with these questions of, first of all, the implicit question is, why isn't punishment working? Right. I mean, that's the question that seems to be behind all of the questions of, should we let him sleep at Kevin's on Friday? And should we let him drive the car? There's really this question of like, how the hell are we supposed to get him to do what we want him to do? And part of what I heard from you in such a nicely articulated way is like, well, the bad news is that's a much more complicated question than you're sort of giving it credit for. And the good news is that's a much more complicated question than you're sort of giving it credit for. Right. Like it's challenging news, but it's also great news because it means there's something to chew on and be thoughtful about it. And it means fundamentally whether or not he sleeps at Kevin's this Friday night is not necessarily the problem, right? It's more the way of thinking about answering those questions. So that was really helpful. And then yeah, this question of how do I know when it's time to send her away, or how do I know when it's time to send myself away, right? And that there's a way of being with that question that is kind of non-authoritarian in a supportive way, right? That's kind of, in a certain sense, that question is no different than any other question that comes up in the course of the coaching relationship. It's just shot through with a lot more desperation and therefore requires more sort of more groundedness, more thoughtfulness, you know.
It kind of reminds me, like, questions aren't always what the questions are, you know. I know, you know, I guess I'm just
meaning that question is really, will I ever get better?
Or you know, you said, when is it time to send myself away or send this person away? And that's a lot of times that means, like, the real question there is, when will I ever be able to relax? When will I ever, how can I feel calm, or how can I feel satiated, or like that I'm doing anything positive? And if that is the question, then there's some, you know, you can do some constructive things. Sometimes you know, I don't ask, is this really what you're saying? But I might sort of change the frame of things by asking something like, if there were one, you know, you'd like 100 things to be different. If there were one thing that you knew could improve, but it could only be one, what would it be? And I think I'm batting 1,000 for getting the kind of answer that someone says, I mean, if I could only, whatever it is, I mean, that would be great. And that's a whole attitude shift. Like, imagine if I could only, man, that would be great. Like, that's a far cry from, I have to do this, plus I have to do a million other things. That's just like what a slog. So it reminds me of like when you're married. So I don't know what kinds of conversations you have, but you know, your wife might ask you, do I look good in this dress or something like that? And sometimes that question could really mean, do you love me? You know what I mean? Maybe I'm getting too, but you know, just, there are always questions hidden in questions.
Sure.
And that means there are reasonable and constructive answers that could be given, instead of, you know, existential and contrived ones,
or overly simplistic ones.
True.
You know.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks.